There is a strange moment that happens to some people in social situations where the room is full of conversation, laughter, noise, and endless small talk, yet inside their mind there is a quiet feeling that none of it truly matters, and instead of feeling energized by all the talking, they feel pulled toward silence, almost like their mind is searching for something deeper than the surface-level words. Everyone else seems comfortable exchanging. If you have ever found yourself standing in a group conversation, nodding politely while thinking about completely different things, or wishing the discussion would move beyond weatherwork, gossip, or casual jokes, then psychology says your brain may simply be wired to process the world in a different way. Many people assume that someone who prefers silence is shy, awkward, or socially anxious, yet research in human behavior suggests something far more interesting, because your brain may actually be searching for meaning, depth, and cognitive stimulation rather than quick bursts of shallow conversation. Psychology calls this tendency depth-oriented thinking, which means your mind naturally filters information looking for patterns, emotions, ideas, and significance. And when conversations remain on the surface level, your brain receives very little stimulation, almost like trying to feed a curious mind with empty calories. This is why small talk can feel exhausting for certain people, because the brain is constantly trying to analyze the situation, wondering why everyone is repeating predictable phrases while your mind quietly drifts toward more meaningful questions about people, life motivations, and hidden emotions. Research shows that individuals who prefer silence often display higher levels of introspective thinking, which means your brain spends a large amount of time reflecting, observing, and analyzing internal thoughts instead of relying on constant external stimulation. This introspection is not loneliness, and it is not social failure. In fact, psychology suggests that reflective thinking is closely connected with self-awareness, the ability to examine your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors with unusual clarity. When your brain becomes comfortable with introspection, silence stops feeling empty and instead begins to feel like a place where ideas form. Emotions become clearer and thoughts organize themselves in ways that constant talking simply cannot allow. Another psychological concept that explains this experience is cognitive stimulation preference, which refers to the type of mental activity that energizes your brain. Because while some people gain stimulation from rapid social interaction, others receive stronger stimulation from observation, analysis, and deep conversation. Your brain is constantly searching for rewarding stimulation, and when small talk fails to activate curiosity, insight, or emotional connection, the mind quietly disengages, not out of rudeness, but because it is simply not receiving meaningful input. You may notice this during everyday moments when someone begins telling a long story filled with surface details and your mind slowly drifts away, not because you dislike the person, but because your brain automatically searches for the underlying meaning behind what people say. Psychology calls this pattern deep processing, which means your mind does not just hear words. It interprets intentions, emotional signals, tone changes, and hidden motivations, almost like your brain is reading multiple layers of the same conversation at once. This deeper processing can make silence feel more comfortable than constant talking, because when you are quiet, your brain can fully observe the environment, noticing facial expressions, subtle body language, and emotional energy that others may completely overlook. Research in behavioral psychology suggests that people who prefer silence often demonstrate stronger observational intelligence, meaning they gather information from the environment quietly rather than announcing every thought that passes through their mind. Think about the moments when you sit in a room with others talking, and instead of jumping into the conversation, your attention moves toward the details of the situation, noticing who is truly listening, who is pretending to laugh, and who seems uncomfortable beneath their smile. Your brain naturally gathers this information because silence allows cognitive resources to shift toward perception and interpretation rather than constant verbal response, which means quiet individuals often become extremely perceptive observers of human behavior. Another reason your mind may reject small talk involves the psychological concept known as social energy management, because every brain has a different tolerance for external stimulation and conversation is actually one of the most demanding forms of social interaction. Your brain must process words, emotions, facial expressions, tone reactions, and timing all at once, which requires significant cognitive effort, and when the conversation itself provides little meaningful reward, your brain quickly begins to feel mentally drained. This is why you may leave certain social events feeling unusually exhausted even though nothing dramatic happened, because the brain spent hours processing noise, information, and shallow conversation without receiving the deeper stimulation it naturally prefers. Psychology often connects this experience with introverted cognitive patterns, yet introversion does not mean disliking people. It simply means that brain restores energy through quiet reflection rather than continuous social engagement. When silence surrounds you, the nervous system slows down, thoughts become clearer and emotional signals become easier to understand, which is why many people who prefer silence describe it as peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Interestingly, research also shows that individuals who value silence tend to experience stronger internal dialogue, which means your brain is constantly communicating with itself, analyzing past experiences, imagining possibilities, and exploring ideas. This internal dialogue is closely connected with metacognition, which is the psychological ability to think about your own thinking, allowing the mind to reflect on beliefs, decisions, and emotional reactions with remarkable depth. While small talk moves quickly from topic to topic, the metacognitive mind prefers space to explore thoughts fully, which means silence becomes the natural environment where deeper thinking can actually occur. You might recognize this when a conversation suddenly shifts toward meaningful topics, like personal struggles, life philosophy, or emotional experiences, because suddenly your attention returns and your brain becomes fully engaged. Psychology explains this shift through intrinsic motivation, because your mind naturally seeks activities that align with its cognitive preferences, and meaningful conversation stimulates curiosity, empathy, and complex reasoning. This is why people who dislike small talk often come alive during deep discussions about psychology, human nature, creativity, or personal experiences, because the conversation finally matches the brain's natural processing style. Another fascinating psychological pattern involves sensory sensitivity, which means certain brains simply process environmental input more intensely than others, including sounds, conversations, emotional energy, and background noise. When multiple conversations happen simultaneously, the brain of a highly sensitive thinker may attempt to process all of them at once, creating mental overload that makes silence feel like a necessary refuge. Research suggests that this heightened processing ability is often associated with deeper emotional awareness, meaning your brain not only hears words, but also senses emotional tension, subtle discomfort, and hidden feelings within the room. This emotional perception can make shallow conversation feel strangely disconnected, because your brain recognizes emotional layers that the conversation itself never addresses. So, while others are discussing everyday topics, your mind may quietly wonder what someone is truly feeling, what experiences shaped their personality, or what struggles they might be hiding beneath their casual words. This curiosity about human behavior often drives individuals toward psychology, philosophy, creativity, or introspective hobbies, because the mind naturally seeks environments where deeper exploration is possible. And psychology repeatedly shows that people who spend more time in reflective silence often develop stronger problem-solving abilities, because quiet moments allow the brain to reorganize information and generate new insights. When constant noise disappears, the brain enters what researchers call the default mode network, which is a mental state where creativity, memory integration, and self-reflection become more active. In other words, silence is not mental an emptiness, but a powerful, the cognitive environment where your brain connects past experiences, present emotions, and future possibilities. This is why some of the most creative thinkers, writers, scientists, and philosophers throughout history valued long periods of solitude, because deep thinking requires mental space. Yet society often misunderstands silence, because modern culture tends to reward constant expression, rapid communication, and social visibility. So when someone chooses quiet observation instead of endless conversation, others may assume something is wrong, even though psychology suggests the opposite may be happening inside the mind. Your brain may simply be operating on a deeper level, searching for meaning patterns, authenticity, and emotional truth rather than temporary conversational noise. And when the right conversation appears, when someone speaks honestly, asks thoughtful questions, or explores complex ideas, you may suddenly find yourself talking more passionately than anyone expected, because silence was never a sign that you had nothing to say. It was simply your mind waiting for a conversation worthy of your thoughts. Psychology reminds us that every brain processes the social world differently, and while some people thrive in constant conversation, others discover clarity, creativity, and emotional understanding in quiet reflection. So, if you have ever wondered why small talk feels strangely exhausting while silence feels comfortable and meaningful, the answer may be simpler than you think. Your mind may not be avoiding conversation at all. It may simply be built to explore the world more deeply, and sometimes the deepest thinking begins where the noise finally ends.